In early 1945 on the east coast of the United States, a joint force was relentlessly searching for an enemy. In particular, thanks to intelligence and the interrogation of captured U-boat sailors, the Americans had learned of a macabre German plan that could severely slow down the Allied advance. U-boats loaded with ballistic missiles were approaching the coast of New York City with the goal of destroying valuable military targets, and to open a new front, this time in North America. But how were the Germans supposed to have developed such advanced technology during World War II, and how did they plan to use it to turn the conflict around 180 degrees? Mounting missiles on submarines is a technology we usually use to develop a global one. How? Is it true that the Germans were the pioneers in this type of naval technology? In 1941, they began very interesting experiments to mount more capable weapons on the U-boats and thus improve their protection when they surfaced. In the secret laboratory of Peenemünde, more specifically on the Baltic island of Usedom, rocket devices began to be developed that, after the war, would allow us to make a great technological leap as humanity. In the summer of 1942, we saw a small sample of this. German scientists welded 30-centimeter rocket launchers onto the deck of a Type 9 designated as 511, making it possible to launch rockets, even while submerged at more than 10 meters without complications. The project was promising, but in 1942, the laboratory decided to abandon it, at least temporarily, to invest all its research machinery in something more promising: missiles. After losing the air battle over England, the German High Command wanted a way to attack the British without having to risk bombers. The response from the scientists at Peenemünde was the Fageltungswaffe 1, the first cruise missile in history. It used an extremely modern pulse engine and was launched from a ramp using a steam generator. Its guidance was very simple. It regulated altitude and speed, and with analog mechanisms, an odometer driven by a small propeller in the nose determined when the missile had reached the target area. And when the programmed count was reached, it would go into a dive. The aerial one. This is how an advance begins in Tahiti, which crosses a terrible area, tends towards the Bible. It comes from seeing versions of facial prisoners sing annual mechanism. In 1521, V1s were launched in Medellin. The angles on English civil were extremely high. By the end of 1943, the technology of the V1 was much more refined. The scientists managed to reduce its margin of error from 30 kilometers to just 10 kilometers, which made them viable for destroying large industrial centers. With them, not just entire cities. Then, the scientists at Peenemünde had a breakthrough. A V1 couldn't attack beyond 220 kilometers. But what if, like in 1941, they thought about launching these missiles from submarines? At that time, right in June 1943, the American threat was the greatest, along with the Soviet one. Therefore, if this new idea was successful, it would be possible to attack the heart of the United States. But in reality, this plan didn't get much attention, since the entire research center was working on a much more important project, the V2. The FERG, the Dunspafer 2, was a full-fledged ballistic missile. It solved many of the problems of the V1. It had a range of 350 kilometers and was impossible to intercept since it flew much higher and at supersonic speed. In fact, it was the first human-made object to fly at more than Mach 1 up to Mach 5 at its maximum speed. And they launched more than 3,000 over England, causing heavy casualties, although in fact, it had almost the same accuracy as a V1. By November 1944, the situation was critical for Germany. So the Peenemünde Research Center was tasked with developing the idea of missiles carried by submarines. But not with the V1 and not with the... Definitely, it was a titanic task. The V2s were almost the size of a submarine. It wasn't possible for any boat to carry something that huge. The solution the scientists came up with was incredible. To develop insulated containers to hold V2S, the containers would be towed by submarines all the way to the American coast. The ballast tanks would be filled inside, changing the position of the containers to vertical. The operators would enter the target data remotely and then launch their missiles. Each Type 21 could tow 3 of these containers, making a fleet of submarines capable of destroying a small city. With a displacement of 500 tons, the containers could also carry other types of supplies to extend the mission's range. It was simply impressive, but if everything was so perfect, why did we never see these containers? Unfortunately, Germany didn't have enough time left to design such a complex system. By the spring of 1945, they managed to reach the planting phase. But the research center's test site would be evacuated in February 1945 with all projects either destroyed or abandoned. The incredible submarine with ballistic missiles never arrived. Especially. But even though it never existed, that doesn't mean the Allies weren't afraid of it. Every time reconnaissance planes photographed the test site, they saw that the Germans never stopped working, even after bombings. Then reconnaissance photos emerged from Norwegian bases with strange covers they couldn't identify, but which seemed to be related to rocketry. The Americans only thought that the Germans were working on some new, bigger rocket. But all that changed in September 1944 when a German submarine was captured while heading to the state of Maine in New England, United States. When they interrogated the crew, they found out that they were there to drop off Oscar Mantell, the crew member, but in addition, he was also an addict. German spy, Mantell was intensely interrogated, and in those interviews he told all kinds of stories about the German submarines. And tell us, what do you know about the U-boats with the V1 missiles? Yes, they exist, and they can launch many missiles, several from each submarine, and they plan to destroy all of New York with them. Believe me, it's the truth. I saw them with my own eyes. The information from the spy combined with the reconnaissance reports made the Americans believe that a massive U-boat attack would rain V1 missiles all over New York, and that if they didn't do something, the city would be destroyed. In November 1944, Operation Teardrop began to be prepared. Massive anti-submarine patrols, both air and naval, were ordered to monitor up to 400 kilometers off the coast of New York. Type of disruption. The threat would even appear in the newspapers so that civilians could also watch the coast. All the equipment was ready to be deployed at the slightest suspicion that something German was approaching the coast. In March 1945, intelligence reported that 9 U-boats had left Norway heading for the United States. Suddenly, the alarms went off, and the generals thought that indeed these submarines were the ones they had been expecting. Operation Teardrop was launched. The Enigma code had already been deciphered, so they were able to track the submarine's movements across the Atlantic. Depth charges managed to destroy several of them. One of the German submarines was even able to torpedo and sink the destroyer United States ship Frederick E. Davis, causing the death of 126 crew members. However, it was captured days later. 2 of the submarines were destroyed and only 1 managed to be captured. However, despite all the investment in war material, in the end not a single V1 was found on the submarines. When the captured sailors were interrogated, they had no idea what the interrogators were talking about. The photos taken in Norway turned out to be just torpedo ramps, not rocket launchers for submarines. And in the end, it turned out that it was all an episode of collective hysteria, but this time within the United States Armed Forces. Not satisfied with the final findings, at the end of the war, in 1946, the submarines United States ship Kask and United States ship Carbonero, loaded with American versions of the V1 rockets, the JB-2S, successfully launched several of these missiles. Studies confirmed that the original German plan would have succeeded. If it had been done that way and carried out, thousands of V1s would indeed have rained down on New York. If you like this video, you might want to know why the Germans wore such baggy pants. Thanks for watching this video, and goodbye.